All right, let's jump right in. Today we're going to unpack the incredible, and yeah, often chaotic, history of Bolivia, a country that's literally at the heart of South America.
So here's the thing about Bolivia. It's this huge paradox, right? You've got a country sitting on just unbelievable natural wealth. I mean, a place that single-handedly bankrolled the Spanish Empire. But at the same time, for centuries, its story has been one of struggle, of being exploited, of just constant political turmoil. It's really a story about incredible resilience.
So to get our heads around this, we're going to break it down into 6 parts. We'll start with the ancient empires, then hit the Spanish Silver Mountain, talk about the birth of the Republic, the revolutions and reactions that followed, the rise of Evo Morales, and finally, where Bolivia stands right now.
Okay, so our story doesn't start with the Spanish. Nope. We've got to go way, way back, high up in the Andes, to a place called the Altiplano. And you've got to understand, this place was anything but empty. It was the cradle of some seriously advanced civilizations.
So check this out. One of the big players here was the Tiwanaku Empire. They were based right near Lake Titicaca. And these folks weren't just scraping by in this tough, high-altitude climate. Oh no, they were absolutely thriving. We're talking massive stone monuments, like the famous Gateway of the Sun, and a huge trade network. For centuries, they were the powerhouse of the region.
And this timeline really shows you just how deep these roots go. I mean, people were domesticating the potato here thousands and thousands of years ago. Then you have the rise of Tiwanaku, which eventually collapsed, probably because of some dramatic climate shifts. And then, a little while later, who shows up? The Inca. The Inca Empire rolls in and basically absorbs this whole area into its massive domain.
All right, now let's fast forward to the 16th century, because this is when everything gets turned upside down. The Spanish conquistadors arrive, and the world they found is just shattered. This moment changes the continent forever and puts this region, which they called Upper Peru, right at the heart of a brand new global economy. And you hear the saying, right, that the silver from Potosi could have built a bridge all the way to Spain. Well, that's not just some nice little phrase. It gets at a reality that is almost impossible to imagine. They found a literal mountain of silver. And Potosi, this mining town, for a while becomes the biggest city in the Americas. The sheer amount of wealth that came out of that one mountain, it paid for Spain's empire, its armies, its palaces, everything, for centuries. So you might be wondering, how on earth did this happen so fast? Well, Pizarro basically got lucky. He showed up right when the Inca Empire was at its weakest, just coming out of a nasty civil war between two brothers. Pizarro just exploited that division, captured one of them, Atahualpa, and bam, the empire crumbled. Just like that, Upper Peru becomes the absolute jewel in Spain's crown. But all that silver came at a terrible, terrible price. The Spanish set up this brutal forced labor system called the Mita. It basically condemned countless indigenous men to die in those mines. And that kind of brutality? It lit a fire of resistance that just never went out. You had Manco Inca trying to create a new Inca state, and then these massive rebellions led by figures like Tupac Amaru II and Tupac Katari. I mean, Tupac Katari's forces surrounded and besieged La Paz for months. The fight was relentless. Okay, so moving into the 1800s, the winds of change are blowing. Ideas from the Enlightenment, revolutions in America and France, all of that starts to catch on, and the desire for independence just boils over. But creating a new nation, well, that was going to be a story of both incredible highs and devastating lows. And this was no quick victory. We're talking a 16-year-long struggle, a brutal war fought across the entire landscape. But finally, in 1825, they did it. Independence was declared, and they named the new country Bolivia as a tribute to the famous liberator himself, Simón Bolívar. And you know, for a little while there, it looked like things were really going to work out. Under this guy, Marshal Andrés de Santa Cruz, they actually united with Peru to form this big, powerful confederation. But, and there's always a but, isn't there, their neighbors, especially Chile, got really nervous about this new power on the block. They went to war, the confederation was crushed, and its collapse just unleashed almost 40 years of pure political chaos, just one military coup after another. And all that instability made them weak, which had absolutely devastating results. The big one, the one you have to remember, is the War of the Pacific. Bolivia lost its entire coastline to Chile, all of it, along with a ton of valuable resources. Just like that, Bolivia becomes a landlocked nation. And that isn't just a fact on a map. It's a deep national wound that shapes their identity and politics to this very day. As if that wasn't enough, they then got into the brutal Chaco War with Paraguay, losing even more land and lives. So, After all that loss and chaos, something had to give. And the 20th century, well, it becomes a huge ideological battleground. You've got this massive push for social justice clashing head-on with powerful forces who want to keep things just the way they are.
Then comes 1952, and boom, everything changes. The National Revolution happens, and it is a huge deal, not just for Bolivia, but for all of Latin America. This party, the MNR, comes in and just completely shakes things up. They gave universal suffrage, meaning for the first time ever, the indigenous majority could actually vote. They nationalized the massive tin mines, taking them out of foreign hands, and they launched huge land reforms. This was a real, honest-to-goodness attempt to build a fairer country.
But that promise, it only lasted 12 years. In 1964, the military steps in. A coup. And that's the beginning of nearly 20 years of incredibly repressive military rule. And I mean, this era was just a whirlwind of chaos, a revolving door of coups and counter-coups. You had a leftist general one minute, then a brutal right-wing dictator the next, like Hugo Banzer. Then came Luis Garcia Meza, whose regime was just unbelievably corrupt and violent. It was a mess. Finally, by 1982, the people had had enough. Massive protests basically forced the military to give up power, and democracy was restored. So, democracy is back. Great, right? Well, not so fast, because democracy didn't magically fix everything. In fact, the country walked straight into one of its worst economic crises ever, and that crisis would spark some pretty radical policies, which in turn would spark a whole new kind of popular uprising.
Just look at this number for a second. 24,000%. That wasn't over a decade. That was the inflation rate for a single year in the mid-80s. Can you even imagine? Your money basically became worthless paper overnight. The economy had completely collapsed. They had to do something drastic.
And that something drastic was a hard pivot to free market, what we call neoliberal policies. They called it capitalization, which was basically a fancy word for privatizing everything. All the big state-owned companies, oil, gas, telephones, even the water systems, were sold off. And yeah, it did stabilize the economy, but it also made a lot of people furious. They felt like the country was being sold off piece by piece, which led to huge protests, like the now famous Cochabamba water war. And right out of that social fire, a totally new political leader emerges, a guy named Evo Morales. He was an indigenous Aymara, a former coca leaf farmer, and he perfectly captured all that anger and frustration. He built a new party, the movement towards socialism, or MAS, and just rode that wave of protest straight into the presidency in 2005. It was a historic, game-changing election. And that brings us right up to the present day, to the 21st century. This whole era has really been defined by Evo Morales, his time in power, the dramatic way it ended, and the massive uncertainty the country has been dealing with ever since.
I mean, you really can't overstate how big a deal his election was. Think about it. We talked about Tupac Katari and all those rebellions, right? This 500-year struggle for recognition. Was this it? Was this the culmination of all that? For millions of people, it absolutely was. It felt like the country's indigenous majority, ignored for so long, finally had a seat at the table.
But his time in office came to a very messy and controversial end in 2019. An election was held and the results were complicated. The official count stopped unexpectedly, and when it came back, Morales had won. And immediately you get two completely different stories. You have one side, backed by reports from the OAS and the EU, saying, hey, there were serious irregularities here, this looks like fraud. Then you have the other side, Morales and his supporters, pointing to other analyses and saying, no, this was a clean win, and what happened next was a coup to force me out.
The aftermath has just been one crisis after another. The MAS party did get back into power a year later with the new president, Luis Arce, but the party itself split right down the middle, with people loyal to Arce on one side and Morales on the other. That infighting opened the door for a big political change in 2025 when Rodrigo Paz won. And all of this is happening while Bolivia is facing its worst economic crisis in 40 years.
So that leaves us with the big question, doesn't it? From that mountain of silver centuries ago to the huge gas reserves today, Bolivia's story has always been this epic fight over its resources and its very soul. Who gets the wealth? Who gets to define the nation? The next chapter? Well, it's still being written. Thanks so much for coming along on this deep dive with us. If you want to see more, definitely check out our Quick Country Histories playlist.